Good morning and welcome to the second weekend of the Charleston Festival. I'm delighted to welcome writers Jans Ondaatje Rolls and Lucy Lethbridge to Charleston, together with our host for today's first session, Virginia Nicholson. Virginia probably needs no introduction to most of you here. Deputy Chairman of the Charleston Trust, granddaughter of Vanessa Bell, and great-niece of Virginia Woolf. A social historian, Virginia's books include the highly acclaimed Among the Bohemians, Experiments in Living, Women Like Us, How 2 Million Women Survive Without Men After the First World War, and Millions Like Us, Women's Lives in War and Peace, 1929 to 1949. Jans Ondaatje Rolls has a long-standing connection to Charleston and Bloomsbury. Her new book, the Bloomsbury Cookbook, Recipes for Life, Love and Art, was published to great acclaim in March and features over 180 recipes that take the reader into the very heart of the Bloomsbury group through the meals around which they congregated, argued, debated, laughed and loved. The Bloomsbury Cookbook recreates an intimate portrait of a vastly influential intellectual and artistic community. Lucy Lethbridge's most recent book is Servants, a downstairs view of 20th century Britain. The book charts the social history of the last century through the eyes of those who served, from the butler, the footman, the maid, and the cook of 1900 to the au pairs, cleaners, and childminders later in the century. So please join me in welcoming Virginia, Jans, and Lucy to Charleston. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to hang around with further introductions. Without further ado, I'm going to ask Jans to give you a short, about 10 to 15 minutes at the lectern and some pretty pictures to accompany it. And then I think we'll go straight into a discussion, the three of us, and afterwards there'll be time for questions. So, Jans,
okay,
yours.
Oops. I'd like you to imagine that you're sitting at a large circular dining table, painted with hoops and swags of grey, green, pink, and white. To your right is Virginia Woolf, who is animated, recounting a story which amuses her so much that tears stream down her cheeks. To your left is the biographer, Lytton Strachey, with his russet-colored beard. He listens to Virginia, smiling, and with one deft wipe, removes a thick, snowy growth of soup from his upper lip with his table napkin. Just then, the cook enters the room carrying an enormous platter of steaming roast grouse. It smells delicious. The candle-lit room is warm. The atmosphere is intimate, abuzz with scintillating conversation. Scenes like this, which actually happened, is what inspired me to write the Bloomsbury Cookbook. 8 years ago, I visited Charleston for the first time and was completely bowled over by its beauty and its creative energy. Every conceivable paintable surface has been covered over in delicious post-impressionist style and color by its artist occupants Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant. Maynard Keynes wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace here in 1919, and Virginia Woolf, Vanessa Bell's sister, was a regular visitor. And it was here in the kitchen that I first made a personal connection with the Bloomsbury group, and where the idea of writing a book about Bloomsbury, looking at their mealtimes, their food, their drink, and their insatiable appetite for life, came to me. This small, highly intelligent, and perceptive group turned their backs on the petty, narrow-minded, male-dominated Victorian society and created a forum where open, honest conversation was fundamental to their way of life. They wrote, painted, organized exhibitions, and lectured, but made a point of meeting regularly to discuss art, literature, philosophy, and simply to gossip. And what better forum is there for exchanging and developing ideas than the dining room table? Despite almost total ignorance of food preparation, the Bloomsbury Group were the foodies of their day, enthusiastic about tasty, unfussy dishes, and passionate about Côte de Provence wines and the heady flavors of southern French cuisine. Their servants went on cooking courses, and they tried cooking for themselves and liked it. Helen Anrup, David, Bunny Garnett, and later Dora Carrington and Frances Partridge became excellent cooks. In my book, I tell the Bloomsbury story from a culinary perspective in 7 broadly chronological chapters, starting from the 1890s with Before Bloomsbury, concentrating on the 1920s with An Appetite for Bloomsbury, and ending in the very recent past with Bloomsbury's offspring. There are some startling discoveries, like a recipe for bread, which goes into the unique bond between Vanessa Bell and Virginia Woolf, both enthusiastic bread makers, and how a new London location for the Stevens siblings, elucidated in recipes, the recipe Apples 46 Gordon Square, is crucial to the flourishing of new freedoms and new friendships. Vanessa, Ben Stephen, and Clive Bell later reveal how game birds and meals on trays set the tone for the group's lifelong communal eating habits. Even the Bloomsbury men, surprisingly, show an enthusiasm for cooking. Roger Fry, in his youth, designs an omelet machine, and later learns to make delicious stews. Bunny Garnett discovers new mushrooms and eats them. Leonard Woolf and E.M. Forster introduce exotic flavors from Ceylon and India. And then Duncan Grant charms his way into their dining rooms and into their hearts. In 1910, a new artistic vision, characterized by bright colors and decorative designs, is introduced by way of Roger Fry and Post-Impressionism. This new aesthetic was liberating and shifted Bloomsbury's focus away from conservative England towards Europe, where personal, honest feelings were permitted and even encouraged. Europeans were unreserved, sensual, and passionate, and this was reflected not only in their art, but also their gastronomy. Gino, in Forster's Where Angels Fear to Tread, for example, devours the spaghetti with uninhibited gusto because it is succulent, flavorful, and satisfying. Porridge in this country, however, appears in pallid gray lumps, and the toast, Forster explains, is like steel. And then the outbreak of war in 1914 precipitates a move out of London to Wisset Lodge, Asheham House, Charleston, and Garsington Manor. As conscientious objectors, energies are diverted into working on farms and growing fruit, but creation continues in both relationships and meals. Vanessa Bell barters potatoes and greens for icing sugar with Virginia Woolf. Carrington makes pots of jams and jellies for her life together with Lytton Strachey. Bunny Garnett, Duncan Grant's lover, takes up beekeeping. And Ottoline Morell, who employs conscientious objectors at Garsington, is accused of being stingy with the food and starving her guests. And then the war is over. With artworks from the 1920s by Vanessa Bell, Roger Fry, and Duncan Grant, the group then establishes itself. The Wolves found the Hogarth Press and become leading literary publishers, fortified by foods such as Hogarth Eccles cakes and Mrs. Dalloway's dinner menu. They invite their friends around for afternoon tea, and one of their regular guests, John Maynard Keynes, is hailed as one of the world's leading economists, having predicted that starvation in Germany would be a consequence of the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. Virginia becomes a modernist literary phenomenon with her stream of consciousness technique, and her extraordinary advocacy for feminism brought us a room of one's own. Referring to the undernourished women's colleges at the University of Cambridge, she made her now famous statement: "A good dinner is of great importance to good talk. One cannot think well, love well, sleep well, if one has not dined well." How right she was. Bloomsbury's fame increased, and relationships became sometimes strangely involved. The complicated polyamorous ménage between Carrington, Lytton, and Rafe Partridge, for example, is elucidated in the recipes Tidmarsh Triptych and Ham Spray Triangles. Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell's love child, Angelica, is born, but Clive Bell takes full responsibility for her. 23 years later, Angelica marries her father's ex-lover, Bunny Garnett. Plover's eggs with Clive and Angelica's birthday roast reveal the particulars of that imbroglio. So, scandals aside, how did the Bloomsbury Group fuel their creative appetites? They traveled to Spain, to Italy, and virtually everyone enjoyed the light and food of Paris and the French Riviera. Foreign influences awakened their senses, and fresh artistic expression burst forth not only onto Bloomsbury's canvases and into the novels they wrote, but also introduced new flavors to their dining room tables. Into The Lighthouse, for example, William Banks is seduced by Mildred's masterpiece. It was rich, it was tender, it was perfectly cooked. Garlic, avocados, exotic herbs, daubes, and other novel dishes stimulate their palates and their imaginations. Somehow, the cooks at Charleston, at Monk's House, and in Bloomsbury become competent at adding French cuisine to their repertoire. Most of the recipes in my book are taken from the years 1904 to 1939, during which there were a great many technological and sociological changes. Widespread use of electricity and plumbing brought the modern kitchen up to speed. Age-old coal and wood-burning stoves were replaced by cleaner, easier to control gas and electric cookers. And proper refrigeration rendered food preservation more reliable. Furthermore, with many servants leaving domestic service to seek employment elsewhere, particularly during the war, Bloomsbury members began to try cooking for themselves. They baked scones and bread, made jams, and rustled up simple meals. But a servant or two was still usually on hand to do the shopping, the washing up, and any or all of the cooking that was considered uninteresting. The Bloomsbury Group had sensational appetites, and its members shared not just their relationships, but also details of their culinary experiences. Scouring for their actual recipes, however, was no easy task, but they're nearly all here, including one or two bizarre recipes, such as Lydia Lopakova's black game, which involves placing a large grouse in a bag, burying it for 2 weeks, which tenderizes the meat, digging it up, plucking it, drawing it, stuffing it with apples and chestnuts, and then braising it long and slowly in the oven before serving it with dumplings and small carrots. Just between us, I didn't try that one. But there are many excellent recipes here too. And Frances Partridge's beef cold fillet and Angelica Garnett's extra good pancakes are indeed just that, excellent. Cooking methods, materials, and tastes, however, have moved on. Boiled puddings, aspic, galantines, mutton, and old boiler chickens rarely, if ever, appear on menus today. And we curb our consumption of butter, cream, sugar, and eggs so that recipes such as lamb's testicles, a cake made with 11 eggs, and plain suet pudding are, by and large, obsolete. But the food scene in England between the two world wars underwent a brief flowering, and Clive Bell's waistline, for example, morphed accordingly. Whilst attending a piano recital in Lady Lewis's drawing room, his waistcoat button burst off his jacket and flew across the room with such impetuosity, Virginia Woolf noted, that the slow movement was entirely ruined. Another amusing aside was Lydia Lopakova in 1930, who invited her dancing partner and choreographer over to Gordon Square for lunch. They ate a delicious liver and soufflé dish. Later, in a letter to her husband, Lydia explained that that afternoon's dancing rehearsal had been rendered impracticable due to the prominence of the food on their insides. Hilarious laughter, she told Maynard, accompanied every step. I couldn't be lifted. Over the past 5 years, I have immersed myself in a world that became my own and made friends with artists, writers, and intellectuals who had disappeared before I was born. But they became my intimates. I went to their houses, occupied their rooms, sat at their tables, prepared and tasted their food, and read between the pages of their reminiscences to include myself in their lives. I did this by creating this book, which for me is much more than a cookbook. It is my love letter to a group of talented, unconventional, and progressively minded friends who created a living ideology based on honesty and freedom that still exists today. Their cooking was the road I took to finding and understanding this ideology. I hope you enjoy reading the Bloomsbury Cookbook and that the anecdotes between recipes amuse and enlighten, and that the numerous artworks included in the book add color and texture to the whole. And maybe some of these old recipes will inspire new dinner parties, perhaps to stimulate another round of avant-garde conversation about the Bloomsbury Group and all the wonder they have left behind for us all.
Jans, that was fascinating, and thank you very much. I feel we're still only scraping the surface because this book is a gold mine, a treasure trove, all the cliches. It's an absolutely beautiful, stunning book, and I do highly recommend it. Not just because of all the things that Jan's been telling you about, but it's just a joy as a production. It's full of the most fantastic illustrations. It's a pleasure to have and to hold. And unlike Lucy's lovely paperback, I haven't dared write all over it. Let's start briefly with Bloomsbury. We did think we'd read it all, didn't we? We thought we'd uncovered every possible aspect of the Bloomsbury Group. And then, Jans, you come along and you unearth something that amazingly seems to have been neglected. And you've talked briefly about what led you down that path, but was it your passion for cooking, or was it your passion for Bloomsbury, or what took you down that route?
I suppose I really wanted to get to know Bloomsbury as a group of friends. I wanted to know them on a more personal level, not just these 20th century icons. We hear about them being a group, and yet most of the things you read isn't about them sort of coming together. And food is a very useful tool. It does bring people together, and that's what friends do as well. They get together over a bottle of wine, a good meal, and they discuss things. That's what we do. That's what Bloomsbury did.
Yeah. But I often think that people see the Bloomsbury Group as this rather cerebral, rarefied, kind of, high-minded group of people who weren't really concerned with the sort of pleasures of the stomach, of the table. And you seem to think that's not true.
No, they were very, very interested in food. In fact, it formed part of their core philosophy, if you like.
It seems to give the lie to that idea of them. I mean, Virginia Woolf is always portrayed, isn't she, as this rather melancholic, rather sort of otherworldly person. And yet...
No, she for instance, the quote I said earlier, a good dinner is of great importance to good talk. One cannot think well, love well, sleep well if one has not dined well. That was Virginia Woolf, and food leads to good, great states of mind.
It's hard to imagine her kneading dough, isn't it?
Maybe that's how she released all her tension. Who knows?
I feel you've really sort of left no stone unturned, no saucepan lid unlifted, maybe, in your search for every possible aspect of Bloomsbury food. I mean, I thought I knew a fair amount about it because I wrote a book a while ago, as I mentioned, about bohemianism, in which one chapter was devoted to food. But, how did you discover this wealth of material?
Well, there's, I went through their archives. I read their letters, their diaries, their memoirs. I went to the galleries. I looked at private collections, looking at their art.
Bloomsbury, of which much is indeed, bottles, apples, or the tables really laid out with delicacies, isn't it?
Absolutely, and Bloomsbury, they loved their food. They wrote about it all the time. So I had so much material, too much material. In fact, when I came to editing the book, it was really twice the size.
and all these rather delicious little details. I mean, I didn't know that Virginia Woolf had enrolled in a cooking school. I mean, it just doesn't figure with one's idea of her, or that Roger Fry, maybe, I can just about compute that he had his own recipe for marmalade, which it turns out that he did. And I love the omelette machine.
Yeah, he was just a schoolboy, which is extraordinary, because we're talking about the year sort of 1880, probably. It didn't work, by the way, but...
The marmalade recipe?
No, the marmalade is good. No,
yeah.
the omelette machine.
Oh, the omelette machine didn't work. So sorry. Have you tried the marmalade recipe?
Yes, it's delicious. It's masses. You get, it's good to make,
big quantities.
Big quantities, yes.
And then one of the other things that really took me aback was finding that Lydia Lopakova, who again has this kind of slightly... fey, eccentric, balletic, rather sort of imaginative quality in my mind. Turns out that she was writing to the Evening News with her recipes for piroshki pies and sorrel soup. I mean, it's a whole different side of these individuals to me.
Lydia, she was a tiny woman. She was 5 foot tall and this wonderful sort of comical ballerina. So it is hard to imagine her cooking. In actual fact, she wasn't a great cook, hence her black game recipe.
Yes, that is bizarre.
So when you come across her recipes in the book, they're just fun to read, really. There's another recipe for ulia, which I actually made, which is this Russian soup. And you have to boil fish heads for about 3 or 4 hours till they resemble rags. And I did that, and I could see it was making a pretty good stock. I had to keep topping up the water. And then I was supposed to clarify it by pulverizing 3 ounces of caviar, which I didn't go that far.
Lucy, I think this is a good place to bring in your fascinating social history of servants in the 20th century, which is also an absolute goldmine of research. And I suppose my first reaction to this book is that today, I have to mention it, Downton Abbey. We have this rather romanticised view of servitude, which is that it was a kind of world of certainties, a world of hierarchies, where people knew their place and where, God's in his heaven, all right with the world, a sort of a rather reassuring feudal view of the world. Is that just rubbish? Was it hell for servants?
I think that the really interesting thing about domestic service is that it's not just about manual labour, it's about an idea. And I think feeding into that idea is precisely that sort of pyramid of class calibrations that we like to think of as I think there is a sort of English notion that this is a kind of ideal of codependency between the classes. And of course, the reality is very different. It's not always the story of mass oppression, but neither is it the story of a sort of cosy certainty. It's somewhere in between, and like all things, when you put them under the microscope, there's such a mass of variables that it doesn't really fit any template. And I think, funny enough, that reading Jans's book, the relationship that Bloomsbury had with their servants, with people like Grace Higgins, is very indicative of what often happened in the slightly cash-strapped middle-class household, is that servants and employers found themselves on a very sort of even keel. They sort of went in and out of each other's lives with a degree of intimacy, which makes them quite difficult, I think, for historians of labour, because they don't fit the classic narrative, as I say, of oppression.
Well, you track this fascinatingly, because you do start off, in a sense, with the great big houses, the Downton Abbeys, shorthand idea of these huge hierarchical things. And then you proceed to unravel and disentangle, as you move up the century, what it was really like. And you seem to have got into the experience. And that's a very difficult, I know this, it's a very difficult thing to find first-hand experiences of servants.
Yes, it was very difficult, and hugely enjoyable at the same time. And there are several sort of working class archives and things, but there's an enormous number of memoirs that touch on this, because in this country particularly, virtually no one who lived before the Second World War has no experience of service, either employing servants or being one, or coming from a family in which people had to go into service. So,
but that's top down. I mean, you'll get a lot of, I've read many memoirs where it's top down experience of servants. Yes. You've managed to find the voices of the servants themselves, and that's remarkable.
Well, I did. I advertised, I interviewed a lot of people, some very, very old people who'd been in service before the war. And their voices are marvellous. Yeah. And then there are some wonderful published memoirs as well that came out in the 50s. There was some sort of burst. It's almost as if people like Margaret Powell and Jean Rennie and Joyce Story, there are lots of them. And it was as if suddenly there's a sort of moment when people were looking at the recent past in a rather sort of anthropological way, and it suddenly came to seem like this sort of sublime pantomime, which was once described as. And a very short time after it had ended, really, with the Second World War. And so you get this sort of burst of absolutely marvellous, often very comical memoirs, like Margaret Powell's. And they, of course, formed the basis for things like Upstairs, Downstairs in the late 60s.
And there are some astonishing details you've unearthed. I mean, I'm just looking at a few of my favourites. Beech Hill Park, the house with a mosaic-covered hall, which had to be washed by hand with milk every week by 5 maids. A lady who had chiffon underwear, which also had to be hand-washed by ladies' maids and wrapped in decorative hand-sewn chiffon pouches. And the house Haythrop in Oxfordshire, is it Haythrop, which employed a full-time vermin catcher, earth stopper and walnut basher. I mean, it beggars belief. Can you give us any more of these examples? Because that's the kind of thing I really adore. I really love it.
Well, I've got them. The most absolutely egregious example of sheer country house success was Woburn, just before the war, where they had an indoor staff of 90 for the Duke and Duchess of Bedford, who were then a very old couple living on their own and not doing much entertaining. And they were I mean, Woburn was like a sort of extraordinary circus, really. And all the parlour maids had to be over 5'10".
Yes.
And if you think...
I'd have been all right, wouldn't I?
Yes, yeah. But that would be quite difficult to find nowadays. And in 1929, 1930, to have found working class girls on a sort of the sort of diet they had in economic depression that were over 5'10".
5'9" need not apply.
Yeah, well, it was exactly.
Yes, but why?
Well, it was a sign of status. You paid a lot more for tall servants.
A scarcity factor.
It was a scarcity. And you see advertisements in the Times, in the Sitzvac of the time, where footmen advertise, that are looking for work, and they will say over 6 foot, or over 5'11", slightly cheaper.
I mean, you've got all these examples of what they cost, and it's a lower wage for a lower height.
Absolutely extraordinary. And it was always sort of wrapped up as something else. There's this wonderful American journalist who went undercover in about 1890 called Elizabeth Banks, and she was fascinated by the English cult of service, really, which she really could find no equivalent in the States at all. And so she decided to go undercover to write a column for her newspaper. And she describes having her arms measured by employers. And it was also dressed up as it would be easier to reach things in the kitchen and things. But in fact, it was sort of height meant wealth, meant sort of physique, it meant a good diet. It just looked good. It was a front of house thing.
I think perhaps we should talk about servants and Bloomsbury, because of course all this food that's on the tables, a lot of the recipes you have produced, Jans, are those of Grace Higgins, and of course, people like Sophia Farrell and Louis Mayer all had a very big part to play in getting food on the table in these houses, Gordon Square, Charleston, what have you. You've not touched a great deal in your book, Lucy, about the Bloomsbury servants, but there's quite a lot of documentation. Would you like to have a little discussion about it?
Absolutely. Well, I know Bloomsbury were really quite fussy about the foods they liked to eat, and so they typically sent their servants off on cooking courses to produce the kind of foods that they really enjoyed. So, for instance, the Wolves servants, Louis, Mabel, and Nellie, they all went off on sort of cooking courses. Virginia herself taught them how to make the bread the way that she liked to make it. And Grace, she learned how to cook by sort of following Elise Alleganti on her trips to France with Vanessa and Duncan, who was their cook there. No, they didn't have the sort of raft of servants to sort of draw on, so they had sort of 1 or 2 servants and made it all work sort of towards the end, which is what Grace Higgins became. So that's how they got what they wanted.
Lucy, any thoughts?
Yes, I was thinking how very interesting it is actually that the Bloomsburys fall rather sort of neatly into that slightly budgeting area of the middle class, but of course are infinitely more cultivated. So they're introducing all sorts of things from abroad and ideas from abroad. But they've still got to sort of, they've got to watch the pennies, haven't they? So there's a feeling that there isn't that vast excess you get with the Edwardian rich or the sort of country house rich, where status is measured by superfluity and abundance and waste.
No, and they, their servants didn't wear aprons or caps, or they didn't wait at table either.
I mean, I think
that's interesting. Yeah. That's very interesting that they didn't wait at table.
No, they sort of presented the food on the sideboards, and Bloomsbury helped themselves.
So the relationship of servants with masters, or more suitably mistresses, I think comes into both your books very strongly, because what came out of this for me, out of your book, Lucy, was this extraordinary sort of blend of guilt and love and anger and affection, and at times it becomes extremely tormented and tortuous, and at times deeply moving. And, I would be prepared to bet that there are a lot of people in this room whose ancestors were probably in that world. And I think it's that sense of contact that you give us with what it felt like for them. It's about cruelty and exploitation, isn't it, too? The hardened, blistered hands.
Well, it is. When I was writing this book, I would get myself into such a lather of outrage and fury at the treatment of servants that I could, and these poor children, because they were 12, 13-year-old girls with hands so hard that they had to wear glycerin at night and keep their gloves on. And the mortification of it, I think. The sense that servitude or to be a servant was not just a job, it was an identity, and a crushing identity.
Humiliation too.
Yes, I think, and those sort of the small petty humiliations, the infantilizing of curfews, for example, when you could come back at night, the never meeting any men. There's
Actually, you don't talk about sex a great deal. Not much.
No.
There is a kind of, there is a hint about the sort of droit de seigneur and the pretty housemaids. I would love to know if you found anything, or was it simply that you couldn't?
Well, everywhere I go, people say, "Where's the sex?"
Sorry.
I'm afraid, and of course there was sex. We know there was sex, and I've talked. Whenever I talk about servants at festivals like this, someone will come up with a story about a grandmother that has. So we know there was, and of course, and in households where people were jostling very close to each other. You've got the hormonal adolescence, within feet of one another in small houses. Of course, there were things going on, but I couldn't find the evidence. And I think that there is a very, very good book to be written, not by me, because I've rather had it, but with someone else to write about, and to go through perhaps the lists of foundling homes and orphanages and so on, and look at the children, the occupations of women who were giving up children or bearing children in illegitimate children, because there were the Times did a sort of investigation in the 1890s into servants being sort of picked up and used as prostitutes. Particularly when they were vulnerable, they came in from the country and so on. They came to London from the country, and I think that there was a lot of feeling about it, but they're getting the evidence. I didn't find. I felt it was a different book, but I hope someone will write it.
But I think there's definitely a flutter of petticoats on the staircases from time to time, isn't there?
Oh, there is definitely.
Yeah. I mean, depending which way you look at it, your book, I feel I wasn't sure at the end whether it was a story of decline or a story of emancipation. How do you see it?
I see it as a story of emancipation. But I think with that emancipation we have also lost something. I think that the idea that in an ordinary home, people of vastly different backgrounds can live for many, many years sometimes, in considerable intimacy, is something we can never reproduce again. I don't think any other workplace quite has that capacity for real intimacy and real affection. But of course, that affection, it was not free. I mean, it wasn't the sort of affection you had with equals. I think quite often when you read employers' accounts of service, they will talk about how their servants were their best friends. Servants very, very, very rarely talk about their employers as their best friends.
It's a different perspective.
And so that perspective, I think one has to remember. So yes, I would say on the whole, it was a move towards emancipation.
Yeah. We might pick that up later, but Jans, your book, I think, is really very much a social history as a recipe book, and I think that's fascinating the way you've blended those two things together. I mean, food as a window on the past. What do you think Bloomsbury food tells us about its times, about the times?
Times. Well, the incredible thing about Bloomsbury is that they saw so many changes. So they grew up as Victorians. Really, they were sort of they lived up in. They had nurseries and they had sort of servants who were down in the basements, by and large, who looked after them. So, for instance, in the Stephen family household, there were 7 servants to look after the 11 members of family that were living there. And then things really started beginning to change. Roger Fry enters the scene sort of around 1910. He introduces post-impressionism, and the food is still sort of Victorian, although it's given sort of French names. This is sort of Bloomsbury's love of France. And then the war comes, and huge changes there. There's rationing. Milk, butter, sugar, meat are all rationed. overnight, meals become shorter and less fussy. The Bloomsburys themselves started taking an interest in bringing the foods to their own tables. I mean, they were working the land. And they had to cook themselves. There's this funny story of Barbara Bagnall who walked over from Charleston to Asham House, and Virginia was there, and she apologized. She said, "Gosh, I'm so sorry, the cook's off ill. I don't know what we're going to do for dinner." And Barbara says, "Oh, I'll cook some scrambled eggs." And Virginia was completely shocked. She said, "Can you really cook scrambled eggs?" It was extraordinary for anyone of their class to sort of, at that point, really have much contact or even know how to cook. And then, of course, after the war, things changed. Bloomsbury traveled to France, and they were able to eat sort of the French foods that they really liked on a more regular basis.
Which you've talked about, but I mean, it is this window onto a different age, and actually I was very glad, for example, that you picked up a little bit of the Bloomsbury world, which is more overlaps with Lucy's, which is Clive Bell's world in his other existence in Wiltshire, which was more the world of sort of kidneys in chafing dishes that you describe, isn't it?
Yes, there's a funny story in your father's book, Elders and Betters, actually. Huh. And he describes visiting his grandparents. And on one side of the dining room were the family seated in their leather sofas and armchairs. And on the other side were the servants all sort of lined up in their sort of black and white uniforms and, with their aprons and their caps. And then grandfather read the Collect of the Day and then read a passage from the Bible. And then I guess it was after this, and the servants would file out and then come back with the breakfast things. But here you have sort of three generations under one roof. You've got the grandparents who are sticking to the Victorian ways, and Vanessa Bell, who can't stand this, the whole sort of pomposity and the show, of the whole thing. And then Quentin, who's really quite amused by the whole thing. Yes. It's some sort of farce.
I think the other overlap that we get a lot of is this kind of very labour-intensive cooking. And I think you both refer to that. I mean, this is a world of galantines and soft roes and bushels of flour and aspic jelly and plover's eggs. And, this is a window onto a different age both of you are giving us.
Yes, I think that's one of the things. If you have people to do things for you, your tastes tend to become more elaborate. I mean, that's because they can. I mean, it's one of those, and then the moment that, of course, that staff is withdrawn, then suddenly the delights of just a simple salad become
You talk
more attractive.
about one of the cooks who did, was it miniaturised food?
Oh yes,
it was absolutely extraordinary.
The
dinky little elaborate thing.
Everything's sort of tiny, and spinach always pureed in little pyramids. And that's slightly OCD, I think, what we would now call sort of obsessively compulsive concern with detail that I think you get, again, if you have someone to do things for you, what a mere whim can harden into a habit or a necessity. So
it's all pushing stuff through sieves, isn't it?
Lots of hair sieves and potatoes cut in exactly the right circles and sent back if they're not the right size.
And it was OCD because that's how the employers, the masters and mistresses, demanded. They could not have their potatoes any other size.
Oh yes, there was one doctor I read about. It was in one of the memoirs who needed to have his chipolatas in the morning. Had to have 3 chipolatas cut into 3s, which is very. I mean, I can't quite remember. That was an enormously elaborate thing that had to be learnt by every incoming.
I want to get Lucy to read you the bit that made me laugh out loud, which is the story of...
It's the story of Celia Fremlin, who some of you may know as a thriller writer. She was a really good thriller writer in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And she, but in the 30s, when she was young, she was a researcher for mass observation. And she went undercover to write a report on domestic service. And she took a variety of jobs. I must say, she would have been absolutely terrifying to have in your household. I forgot. But one of the jobs she took was I think it was a kitchen maid to an old dowager living in London, and this is about 1938, and she has a staff of 8. And Celia Fremlin describes the preparations for supper, and the Dowager had announced that night she would like to have a cup of Benger's food, which I think is a bit like Ovaltine. It's a sort of malted milk, and 1 digestive biscuit. And she writes, so like a vast machine set in motion, the 8 members of the staff were mobilised as if for a full-time dinner party. First, the housekeeper came down to the kitchen to tell the cook that this was to be the menu tonight. Then I, the scullery maid, was dispatched to fetch the new tin of Benger's from the storeroom and the special enamel saucepan. I handed them to the kitchen maid, who took the lid off and handed the tin to the cook, together with the necessary apparatus. The cook then set to work making the Benger's. Now the footman came into action. He went to the butler for the key to the cupboard, which contained her ladyship's silver tray. The butler gave him the key and waited while he took out the tray. Then the footman put the tray on his trolley and wheeled it to the kitchen, where the Benger's and digestive biscuit were now standing in state awaiting him. He put them on the tray and wheeled it off to the hall. Here the tray was taken by the head housemaid. She took it up to her ladyship's landing and knocked on her ladyship's door. It was opened by the lady's maid, who took the tray and disappeared. And Celia Fremlin says it's like watching a 100-ton crane picking up a safety pin, which I think is rather brilliant.
No,
Marvellous.
it's absolutely extraordinary. And also, Lucy, it's full of these wonderful lost skills, isn't it? I mean, the valet who has this special expertise in washing red hunting coats and maintaining buckskin breeches, or the young woman whose speciality is skinning eels.
Oh, yes.
I mean, it just is incredible. You've got to read this book. It's totally extraordinary. I'll open it up to the floor in a moment, but I just want to ask Jans, I don't think many of us here, maybe I'm wrong, have cooks today, but I do think quite a lot of people who are reading your book will want to try some of your recipes. So I think, galantines aside, I want to know whether you tested them and which is your favourite. And did you really make Helen Ann Rep's suet pudding?
I did make Helen's suet pudding as part of the jam roly-poly recipe, so it's actually okay if you add jam. I made them all over about a 4.5-month period.
How did your family react?
After 3 days, they were begging for a salad. They cook with enormous amounts of, cream, and it was really, really heavy. But actually, the flavors themselves were pretty good. You know?
Do you think the portions were smaller? Because this is the one thing I find absolutely riveting about the past. The excesses of what we now think of as very unhealthy.
Yeah.
I think the portions must have been much smaller, otherwise they'd have been huge.
I think they were smaller. I mean, they had a lot more courses as well.
I think they burnt a lot more calories because their houses were cold.
Oh yes, there is that, yes. Yes, and a lot more walking, perhaps.
Absolutely.
So which is your favourite recipe and which is your least favourite, Jans?
Well, it really depends on what you like. I mean, if you like tripe, for instance, you might, enjoy the tripe soup. I don't. So I would
the
say
tripe soup to you.
I made it, but I didn't like it. It's probably, pretty good, I suppose. My husband would probably enjoy it. The soup recipes are fantastic. Some borscht recipes, there are 2 different recipes in there which are incredible. The beef recipes, that hasn't changed too much. I think the best thing about these recipes is that they are of their time, and a lot of them don't really sort of conflict with the memories that we have with food today. So for instance, if I think steak, steak is, I think of summer barbecue. Whereas if I think of mutton, I immediately think of Leonard Woolf sharing a mutton pie with T.S. Eliot. So it's great at sort of jogging and creating new memories.
Let's open it up to the floor. I think we have a couple of microphones. And do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, there's a lady over here on the left. And does anyone else have a question meanwhile? So that we can get a microphone to you ready? Not yet. Think about it and we will. Yes.
It struck me very much when you were describing the supper being made for the Dowager Duchess that it was like what you hear about the unions at their very worst.
The
Unions at their very
unions.
worst.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yes, well, I think there probably was that. I mean, domestic service, there was a domestic service union, but as you can imagine, employers strongly discouraged their servants from joining it. And so it was fairly toothless. But yes, there was that, there is that sense of sort of jobs being, sort of maintained for the sake of them. And in the 30s, interestingly, I think because it was a time of economic depression, responsible employers, even when they couldn't afford to keep their servants, were very unwilling to turn them out or sack them. So often these households, which looked to us like vastly excessive, were in fact actually run by rather caring employers who simply didn't want to turn out often quite elderly servants onto a market which was the mass unemployment.
Do we have another question from anybody? Yes. Any more?
I'm fascinated, Lucy, by this world of a large house with a lot of servants. I believe they were kind of trapped there. They didn't get a lot of time off. Is that right? They worked. So how did they find people to marry?
Well, I think one of the really moving documents, one of the most moving documents I read when I was doing the book is a 1916 report by a sociologist called C.V. Butler, who sent out thousands of questionnaires in a very modern way to lots of sort of girls working in ordinary homes, not country house servants, because they do occupy a slightly different space, the country house servants. And when you read the reports that come back, the most heartbreaking thing is the loneliness, above everything, of being a single-handed maid in a rather parsimonious household where you get an afternoon off a week and then have to be back by 9 with your employer sort of standing by the door as though you're a teenager. This feeling of that the only escape is marriage, and yet there is no one to meet. You go to the Girls' Friendly Society Club where it's all girls like you and you do Bible study. You know, that might be your option for an evening.
Margaret Powell always hung out with the delivery boys, didn't she?
Well, Margaret Powell married a milkman.
Yeah.
And I think that often you find when servants did marry in households like that, they married the only men that they regularly saw, which were the grocery delivery boy or the milkman like her, or someone who came to the house often, the sweep. There was one servant I read about who married the sweep, but he only came twice a year, so she was always sort of waiting, hoping he hadn't found someone in the interim.
It's a rapid romance. Do you think these recipes do work today, Jans? I mean, some of them seem to me a bit far-fetched.
Well, those are the obvious ones.
Yes.
Sort of a recipe for a bread recipe for a bushel of flour.
Yes, I don't know what a bushel is. Do you know what a bushel is?
Well, it makes 100 loaves.
Oh,
a lot.
It makes a lot. I wanted to, but I couldn't figure out how to cut it down.
right.
I think they do work today, actually. I mean, I did them all, and they were really interesting.
I think also the other thing I should point out is that Jans has done some really interesting interpretation. Not every single recipe in the book comes from the archives of Bloomsbury itself, because otherwise I think there wouldn't be enough. But what you have done is you've done really quite exhaustive research in pinpointing who were the books that they would have used, who were the cookery writers they would have seen, the kind of currency of today's recipes, just as you or I today might cook from Nigel Slater or whoever.
Yes.
You're looking at the Nigel Slaters of their day.
Absolutely. I mean, they're, Mrs. Beeton started, I think the first recipe I have in the book is 1895. It's a recipe for Toby Stevens' birthday cake. And then Lady Cartilly Peroni was a very sort of popular cookbook of the day as well. Marcel Bulliston as well. And he was a favorite amongst Bloomsbury's as well. Speak up while it's raining. Because he made had recipes for the French food that Bloomsbury absolutely adored.
Anyone else from the audience? Yes, Michael. Michael Carlton.
We're all, I beg your pardon, we're all obsessed by pensions these days. And I just wondered, in general, what happened when servants retired? And specifically, did the Bloomsbury group look after their servants in retirement?
Yes, they did, actually. Sophia Farrell, who was the Stephen family's cook, who began working there sort of, 1890 sort of thing. Virginia sent her a check every year in her old age. Grace, when she retired in 1970-71, Duncan gave her some money to keep going as well. They did.
Well, good employers looked after their servants, but pensions were virtually unheard of. And I interviewed some servants who had only been servants in the 60s, 70s, and were living in great poverty, had no protection at all. So you were dependent on the whim of your employer, the kindness of your employer, to either produce a little cheque for you or to look after you in other ways, maybe to keep you on as a kind of retainer, which again, although I think often that is a relationship of great affection, and it's something we would think now with some nostalgia, I think, of that relationship. It often means that the servant just isn't free to leave. They may actually prefer to go and live on the coast somewhere in a house of their own. But if they have no pension, that's not ever going to be possible. So they are sort of trapped within a relationship that they have to find agreeable.
Had a question in the front row? It was exactly the same. Right. I would love to pick you up, Lucy, just because at the end of your book, you allude to a revival of domestic service today. And that really fascinated me. You said there are as many domestics in London in 2011 as there were in the 19th century. Can you talk about this re-entry into the world of servants?
Well, interestingly, I think what we have now is, in a way, a kind of older form of domestic service, because in the 19th century, domestic service was quite highly regulated. There were agencies. There were various forms of things like references by which you had some sort of protection, certainly as an employer. Employee rather less protection, but the agencies did produce, they interviewed and often vetted. Oh, it's like a monsoon, isn't it?
It is.
But
Yeah,
is that
that might help.
is that better? Oh. Is that on? Anyway, maybe it's all right. Is it on?
Put it up close.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. But I think, but now what we have is a vast, unregulated, often unseen workforce, especially in cities, and particularly in London, of immigrant labour, often illegal, cash in hand, and unprotected, and to a large extent invisible in a way I think that the old-fashioned servant used to be. And I think that this is an aspect which is not really fully acknowledged. It doesn't look the same as the old form of service, but it is the same. But modern households, still require manual labour in order that women should go out to work, or that two-income families need help with childcare, with cleaning. And of course, the largest form of all now is caring for the elderly, the residential carer, of which we're seeing an increasing number.
But we don't call them servants?
No, we don't, because servant suggests an identity that we no longer feel comfortable with. And in a way, it's sad, because the word servant is a marvellous one. It has its origins in sort of Christian humility. And servant, the word servant is now used only for things like civil servant or public servant, where we honour it as a mark of selflessness. But in the domestic sphere, we would feel very uncomfortable with that now.
Any more comments from the audience? Yes, the lady at the back there, if we can get a mic to her. And I think our valiant sound team are having a spot of bother at the back, but maybe we're winning.
Yeah.
Yes.
My question is about service. What kinds of resistance and rebellion about service did you find? In India, for example, in the last 5 years or so, where service is still normal, it's not unheard of to hear of constipation pills in the soup, sleeping pills, murder by servants of their, quotes, masters is becoming almost every other day in the press. So I wonder what kind of rebellion you came across.
I hope everyone heard that question. If you want to
talking
just
about
repeat it,
rebellion,
Lucy.
I'm being dripped on.
Are you being dripped on?
I think there were sort of small cases of rebellion. Winifred Foley used to sing the Red Flag when she was doing the washing up. And there was a rather splendid story I heard. Someone told me about a butler at Madresfield House in Worcestershire who had he'd been a non-commissioned officer in the war, and when he came out of this was the Second War, and when he emerged, he was too old really to find other employment, so he was forced back to being a butler and deeply resented it, and had become very politicised and left-wing in the option. And he apparently used to spit in the food. I mean, this is what I was told by an under-butler, but these were very small. There wasn't a sort of mass movement of rebellion. What there is it's generally a sort of top-down thing, so that several kind of philanthropic figures or civil servants like Violet Markham, for example, who is the great campaigner on behalf of domestic servants, looked to find ways in which domestic service could be regulated further and girls could be more protected within it. But from domestic servants themselves, there doesn't seem to be very much movement, except of course the movement to get out, and in a way that's curtailed by outside forces. So after the First War, for example, a lot of women, there was a huge upsurge of hope that working class girls would be able to take up the new opportunities that were being offered to middle class women. And, grammar school girls, they might become teachers, they might take up professions, become secretaries, all these new jobs were opening up. But economic depression forced them back into service. So you get this rather, this sort of artificial galleon that continues afloat throughout the 30s, even as everyone realises that domestic service of that type is really on the way out. And I think attitudes change. So there was a feeling that women would not, and indeed men, but mostly by that stage women wouldn't stand for it for very long. And indeed after the Second World War they didn't.
Jans, can you comment on that from the point of view of Bloomsbury, because their attitude to their servants and their servants' attitude to them is actually quite fascinating, isn't it?
Virginia Woolf had a very sort of...
Can you hold it a bit nearer?
Yeah,
thanks.
is that better? Virginia Woolf had this problem, which she called the problem of Nellie being her cook, who they didn't have sort of the sort of 5-story divisions in the Bloomsbury houses. Basically, they were all living on 1 or 2 floors, so the servant was really just in the next room. And the problem with Nellie is that she had this sort of intimate relationship with Virginia. And Virginia, adored Nellie, but at the same time sort of could sort of backstab her in a way. And she referred to her as sort of that she hated the timid, spiteful servant mind. But it was really the sort of this mutual dependency that they had on one another. Nellie was sort of quitting every sort of other month, which sort of left Virginia high and dry, but she never actually left. Virginia really wanted to be liberated from service. She really, from having servants.
She both wanted to and couldn't be.
She wanted to go to you needed the servants because you didn't have all the sort of the washing machines and stuff that we have today. So you actually desperately needed to have staff.
Yeah. Do you think she should have gone for a room of one's own, 500 a year, and a housemaid?
Yeah. Well, she sort of had all that, but that's exactly what she wanted.
Yeah.
She wanted sort of to have a room of one's own. She didn't want the servant to sort of be hanging around her the whole time. She just wanted sort of peace and quiet. And so she sort of really resented having to have a servant. And she was really happy, really, from 1934 when Nellie left. And she had a daily. So after that, they only really had daily help.
I think that's actually, if I could just add, I think that's a very interesting theme of the 1930s, is that a lot of women writers, sort of journalist writers of columns, make their domestic frontline the subject of their work. And you get this huge theme, the sort of Mrs. Miniver theme, the tremendous conflict between the ideal conditions in which the female mind might flourish and read John Donne, and the terrible domestic travails that constantly impinge on that. And that becomes a sort of, that becomes the subject, particularly of women columnists. R.M. Delafield, I'm sure you know, the Diary of a Provincial Lady is another one who is constantly battling the servants who are threatening to walk out, and as being a sort of threat to women and their work.
But I think that's
and
one of
their
the
internal
triumphs
work,
of
their
your
inner life.
Sorry, I think that's one of the triumphs of Lucy's book, is that she gets inside both sides. I don't feel you have an agenda, and I feel you've, managed to portray what it's like both for mistress and for servant. So, terrific stuff. I think we're going to end it there in case we all get drowned. Alistair.
Well, I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Jans, Lucy, and of course Virginia for an absolutely fascinating session. I'm sure we could spend a great deal of time delving into servitude and Bloomsbury and the intersection of the two. But really a huge vote of thanks to Jans and Lucy for coming and sharing their books with us today. So please join me in thanking both of our speakers. I know that